Welcome to the Highland Heights Bible class. This is week 3 of our online Bible class, and we're thankful to all that are joining us this morning. If you haven't been with us for the past 2 weeks, we have been going through Acts chapter 2. The first week, we spent a lot of time looking at the first 40 verses of Acts chapter 2, or the first 41 verses. Sorry. And last week we slowed down a whole lot, and we are going to slowly, methodically go through the last part of Acts chapter 2. So I'll go ahead and start off with our reading tonight. If you haven't watched previous weeks, that's okay, but you probably do want to read Acts chapter 2, verses 1 through 41. And now I'll read verse 42. And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. Now, tonight, we're just going to talk about 3 words, and the fellowship. What does that mean? So, Jeremy, I'll toss it over to you. We ask this big question: what does fellowship mean, and why is it so important to the church?
Well, what it means is more than what we think it means. When we say the word fellowship, usually what we mean is a potluck, which a potluck is a perfectly acceptable means of fellowship. But there is more going on in this word than just coming together for a meal. Again, that can be part of it, but there's more to it than that. I've mentioned before, I don't usually delve into the Greek, but I think it's important here. The word here is koinonia, which derives from the same root word as another word you will hear a lot about in New Testament studies, koine. Koine is used to refer to the dialect of Greek that the New Testament was written in. There is the classical Greek that, the philosophers spoke and things like that. Right. And then there's basically street Greek, the Greek that was used in common everyday language. And that's where the root word comes from, is the idea of common. So when you're talking about koinonia, this is where the idea of fellowship, it's translated in various ways in different passages in the New Testament. Sharing in 1 Corinthians, this is where we get our term communion that we use for the Lord's Supper. In Romans, it's actually used for contribution. And some translations have labeled this as contribution. But if you look at what's going on here, there's probably more going on to it than that. It's the idea of the things that we have in common. Again, material things is part of that. We'll come back to that in a later lesson. But it's the idea of we have in common, yes, material things, but thoughts, ideas, beliefs, loyalties. It's this idea of living a common life. That's what the author of Acts, Luke, that's what he's getting at here, is they lived a common life. They were all on the same team. They had the same goals. They were going in the same direction. And it grows out of some of the stuff we talked about last week. The apostles' teaching is kind of what pulls them together. And so they are building a community based on that teaching. And so they are depending upon one another. They're building that community. It's a shared sense of identity that they are building in this passage.
Right. And, you talk about identity there. Any group of people can have commonality. Any group of people can have communion with each other. It just might not be a Christian community. It might not be a Christian communion that they have. And so I think 1 John chapter 1, where it talks about having fellowship with the light, that if we're walking in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another. If we choose to walk in Jesus, we have fellowship with each other. In the same way, if we have an outside group that we're a part of, we come together for a common cause. We rally around those ideas. Or a group that would be opposed to that would rally around a separate group of ideas. So we as Christians come together around Christian ideas. The reason why our potlucks are as fun as they are is, yes, the food is good, but food's good in a lot of places. Our potlucks, our coming together for social activities, church services, all of those are good because we have something in common with each other. And so we're able to speak the same language. Go back to that idea of the Koine Greek. We're able to converse with each other and to share these ideas in common with each other. Trying to think, what are, but before we talk about some of the ideas that we do have in common with each other, what are other practical ways that we can be together? What does that usually look like in a church setting?
I mean, I think it can look like a lot of things. We can, like you said, we come together to talk about the same ideas. We speak the same language, and that can be a challenge when you have someone who is coming in.
Good point.
And you want to make sure when they're coming in that you don't get into that inside baseball, if you will. Sorry, that's an analogy that's right in my wheelhouse.
Sure.
But you want to make sure you don't get into that inside language when you have someone coming in and accidentally exclude someone. But we come together, we speak the same language, we are in one another's lives. Excuse me. We are building one another up. We're helping one another. We are looking out for one another. When someone needs help, we're there. One of my favorite authors, he writes several weekly newsletters, but this is the one he does on Friday that's free. Jonah Goldberg wrote a newsletter the other day talking about the idea of social capital. And he was building off of this idea of the statement that, so many people live paycheck to paycheck and, are one missed paycheck away from losing their home and things like that. And he said, and one of the point he was making was, look, if you have social capital, you are not truly one paycheck away from being without a place to go. And he says, think about the friends and the family members you have who would let you stay in a spare room, crash on their couch, would be there for you, or would come together and say, okay, let us help you pay your mortgage. You think about it, one of the practicalities of our communion, our commonality, is we have that social capital in the church. So it's, we talk about the same things. We are there for one another. And perhaps most importantly, we're all going the same place. You think about when a Christian dies, one of the hopes that we talk about is we're going to see them again one day. Mm-hmm. So we have a similar hope. And that can help build one another up and help hold one another up in times of stress, in times of struggle. So it really is the building of that sense of community where we are in one another's lives. We have the same goals, the same mind, the same hope. And it doesn't matter where we come from, what our background is, when it comes to being with one another.
Yeah, I liked what you said there at the beginning about we need to be careful to not limit the uniting nature. What I think that means is don't pile on extra obstacles to become a part of the church. I guess what we're going to talk about next are what's the simple foundation that we should have. And to the extent that we say, this is the core, it should be easy for people to become a part of our group. And we should be welcoming of them. We should want them to get fully engaged. And so to flip that on its head, when we ask the question, well, what does it mean for someone to be in the group, to be a Christian? I would say that a mature Christian, so maybe this doesn't happen on day one, but a mature Christian is someone who desires fellowship. And this isn't an introvert extrovert thing or, wanting to be social, but it's who do you desire to be and to be a part of? Mm-hmm. You should desire to worship God. You should desire for your own life to be changed, and you should desire to be with the family. I think that is a healthy mark of what a mature Christian grows into. So I guess we're kind of hinting at this idea of where we're going next. At the idea of, all right, so we have this idea of commonality. We have the idea that we're coming together, but coming together around what? Now, verse 42 that we read earlier, we could make the connection that and the fellowship is referring back to the apostles' teaching. It was just previously mentioned a matter of words ago, but that seems fairly short. We have the rest of the New Testament to fill out this idea for us. So let's flip over to Ephesians chapter 4. Jeremy, why don't you kind of lead us through those thoughts there?
Well, the idea going on, and give me 1 second while I flip to Ephesians chapter 4 over here.
Yeah.
The idea here is one of the challenges that you see throughout Christian history, particularly since the Protestant Reformation, is this idea of unity. What do we rally around? And it gets very challenging to build this community. And it is hard to build a community if you don't have something that unites it all together. You know, there's communities all over the world, communities in all aspects of our lives. I mean, you know, if you're a fan of a sports team, you're part of a community that roots for that sports team, and, you know, roots against your rivals, you know, and things like that. And that's the thing that unites you. That's what pulls you together. So in Ephesians, there is this kind of implication throughout the book of Ephesians where Paul is dealing with an issue of bringing them together. You see that in Ephesians 2, the dividing wall of hostility that has been broken down between the Jews and the Gentiles. You know, to go back to something we've talked about a couple of times prior, in Acts 2, you are bringing together people that their commonality is that they're all Jews, but they probably have very, very differing and varying interpretations of what Judaism means, especially once you get out of within Palestine, you had it. You get out of Palestine, it gets even more diverse. And so you're building a community around these sets of ideas. And I like the connection you made between the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, because that's what you're building this on, is the apostles' teaching. So in Ephesians 4, and we've probably heard this passage a lot, the 7 ones. I know when I was in college, I heard about that probably every semester. No matter what the Bible class was about, at some point the 7 ones were going to come in, which by the way is not a bad thing. I'm not criticizing my Bible professors. They're very, very good Bible professors. But Paul says, backing up to the beginning of the chapter, I, therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Well, where are we going to get this unity, Paul? There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope that belongs to your call. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. So those are kind of the 7 things that we rally around. Now, again, when you get into application, when you get into application, it gets broader. But really, these are the 7 things that Paul in Ephesians says, okay, this is what pulls us together. And if you look at it, none of these things are really about us in the sense that we're making this decision. We are added to the body. We receive the Holy Spirit. Okay. We have the hope of eternal salvation in Jesus Christ. We have faith. We have trust in God. Okay. So we have that shared sense of trust in God. We are baptized into Christ. We have one God and Father of all. Okay. So those 7 ones, that's what unites us. That's the foundation of community. And if you look at it, that community comes when we submit to Christ.
And I would also say that, we often have conversations about, well, who's a Christian and who's not. this is a pretty good place to start.
Absolutely.
I guess 1 Corinthians 15 would be another one where most Christians will say, if you disagree with this, it's hard to call yourself a Christian. It's hard to be united when you can't come together on core doctrinal issues. To use the sports analogy again, when I was a little kid, around Thanksgiving Day, my family would get together. They wanted to watch one sports event. And because I was an annoying little kid, sometimes I would root against the team that everyone else was rooting for. I'd root for the other team. I was asked to leave the room. I was not a part of what was going on there. And likewise, we are welcoming to anyone who wants to come into our building, even chiefs of sin, people who are actively in sin. Come. You need to hear this message too. But to really be a part of the family, to call yourself a member, a partner in the gospel, you have to sign on. You have to be on board with the unity message. And we don't get to define the unity message. I think that you're talking about how none of these are dependent on us. Kind of what underlies that is we are not the ones who get to choose the things that unite us. We don't get to decide what truth is. And so because that is exterior to us, we shouldn't feel as Christians that our fellowship is exclusive. We shouldn't feel that we are what we're often called. We're not bigots. We are not, we're not closed-minded, narrow-minded. We are open to what God has told us. And if anyone is closed-minded, and I hate to say it that way, but God is closed-minded on the truth. God has already decided what the truth is, and to the extent that we are willing to accept that, I think that is our line of demarcation. Those are our close-handed issues, to use other language that we've heard before. So
yeah.
Okay, so go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think you're exactly right, which is good. We have unity on this, but we need to make sure that we are keeping God at the beginning and letting God be the one that determines fellowship. And be very, very careful drawing those artificial lines of fellowship. On the flip side of that, we need to make sure we know what God says, which goes back to what we were talking about last week with the apostles' teaching, so we recognize when things don't line up with what the New Testament teaches.
And so we brought up Ephesians 4, 1 Corinthians 15, which are good texts to start with on matters of unity, matters of faith, matters of doctrine. You get some people, on the other hand, will say, well, that's it. Those are the two lists. That the rest of New Testament teaching or biblical teaching altogether doesn't matter. As long as we're united on those things. And I'm glad that we can unite around those things, because if you're not, I won't call out specific groups, but there are specific groups that don't unite on these things, and it makes me a little mad when anyone questions whether or not those people are Christians. Like, well, no, they don't even believe that Jesus is the one and only Son of God. Come on. But we also need to realize that just because it's not the first thing on the list doesn't mean that it's not, it's not in the teachings of God.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And, and you're right. We need to make sure that we are saying, okay, look, here's the basics. Everything else builds out from here. We also need to make sure that we're giving room for people to grow. In 1 Corinthians, Paul, he deals with the issue of meat sacrificed to idols, and he looks like he gives three answers. Yes, no, don't ask. What's really going on there is he's got three different scenarios in mind, and I won't go through all of that because that would take the rest of our time to kind of unpack all of it. You'll have to come to Jeremy's
class on Romans to hear those examples. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Okay. But it's very, very evident that when Paul is talking to the Corinthian Christians about meat sacrificed to idols, as you read between the lines, it becomes pretty clear that you've got some Corinthian Christians that they're gung-ho, yeah, Christ is the Son of God and he is God in the flesh, and I believe that. They're just not 100% clear on monotheism. And they have some growth to do. And in the same way, the Judaizing conflict over the Jewish law, you've got some Jews who Jesus is the Messiah. They're not ready to let go of the law of Moses yet. So there's growth that has to happen as well, that we need to make sure that we give people room and time to grow. Not just shut them down and say, okay, if you don't agree with me on this and you don't see it, why, you're not a Christian. God is the one that determines who's in the fellowship. Now, he's given us his teaching, and he has said, okay, if they don't align with this teaching, they're not part of the fellowship. But we need to make sure that we are giving people room and time to mature. Like you said, you may not have it all straight in your head on day one. But hopefully over time, that commitment to Christ will cause growth. And that's another aspect of fellowship, is we are coming alongside these people and saying, let us help you grow in a spirit of love.
Yeah. And it is loving to want someone to grow.
Absolutely, yes.
Aquila and Priscilla is the classic example of showing someone the way more accurately. I think that if I was in the wrong, and now obviously everyone thinks that they're right about the things that they currently believe, otherwise they wouldn't believe them. But to the extent that my brother Jeremy or any of my brothers or sisters that are at the Highland Heights congregation, if they come to me lovingly and want to further discuss some topic, I should be not only willing but honored to hear them out, because a part of fellowship is willing to have sometimes difficult conversations. But when it's about Scripture, it shouldn't be difficult. It should be something that we very much willingly do.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about this idea of changing ourselves, of being transformed by fellowship, perhaps even being transformed to be ready for fellowship. Jeremy, what are you thinking along the lines of how not only the list here, but just the idea of fellowship changes us?
Well, hopefully in the idea of fellowship, we are living out what Jesus said in the Gospel of John. They'll know you're my disciples by your love. Mm-hmm. Okay. And that really is kind of at the core of this, is seeing our fellow Christians, and obviously everyone else, but particularly our fellow Christians, as people who are made in the image of God, people who are on the same team. And so people, you want to go to bat for them. Okay. People who, you may have heard the phrase, within your family, you can squabble all day long. Somebody from outside the family comes in, it don't matter what you think of your brother or your cousin or your aunt or your third cousin twice removed, or however far out it goes. I guess ultimately, going back to Noah, we're all family. You're going to be there. And you remember that regardless of whose team, regardless of what that other person may say or do, you are on the same team, because we're all part of this fellowship with these common ideals, these common goals. And so out of that flows this idea of, I'm going to be there for my Christian brother or sister, that social capital idea. And we begin to grow closer to one another through that and in that.
Yeah. Earlier we talked about the idea of humility being built in here. Your social capital ties, the person who could give you that short-term loan, or could lend you their truck to move across town, or could give you a place to stay for the night or a month or whatever. None of those social capital ties do you any good if you are not willing, if you're not humble enough to ask for them. Mm-hmm. There have been so many times, there have been so many times when I've been wrong, but also so many times when I just don't know things. And it's often my brothers and sisters at church who I can say, hey, you know something about this, or you work in this field, or you've gone through this this tragedy before. You've gone through this hard time. Talk me through it. What advice do you wish you had on the front end that could have gotten you out in a better place once you did walk through that? And at the same time that we need to be humble enough to be willing to ask for that guidance, I think we also need to be humble enough as the people who currently have that knowledge, have that wisdom. I think it also takes a bit of humility to not wait on someone to come to us and ask us, but just to go, to be the person who is being proactive. Knowing ourselves, knowing our place within the congregation, and that takes that sort of deep fellowship means that we're not still trying to do the surface level relationship growing that comes from just sitting next to each other once a week for an hour. It's something that takes hours a week. It takes weeks and months and perhaps even years to get to a place where we're comfortable really building each other's lives. And Jeremy, as you said, being comfortable as a family, as a biological family is comfortable with each other. So that humility doesn't come on day one, not because we're not transformed, but because you just can't do it without real knowledge of each other.
Right. There's a sense of being present in one another's lives. And that day-to-day interaction, I'm a teacher, and this time of year is always very, very interesting because you're watching kids that have been in your classroom, and especially if you've taught at a smaller school. I taught a class one year, at one school, the first class I taught them in was 7th grade Bible. I taught them in 8th grade, some of them in 8th grade, some of them in 9th grade, some of them in 10th grade, some of them in 11th grade, some of them, and then in 12th grade, I had them for 2 classes.
It must have been rough.
It was hard on them. I know they were so excited when they never had to come to my classroom again. But it was, and I remember having to work to kind of keep my composure during their senior chapel because they had been part of my life. I had been a part of their life every day since, one little guy was 5 foot tall when I first met him. He was 6'1" when he walked across the stage, and I watched him stretch it all up. And that's the idea of we are in one another's lives. We're present in one another's lives. We know one another well enough to be able to talk about these things. You were mentioning earlier, having those scriptural discussions. We trust one another enough to have those discussions about things that we very, very deeply hold to, that someone else may disagree with us on. And still at the end of that discussion, even if we say, you know what, we haven't resolved it now, we agree to disagree, we haven't broken those bonds. We trust one another enough. And that is kind of a core idea of being with one another. And being willing to surrender those rights, like Wayne talked about in the sermon last Sunday. That humility may include surrendering our rights, and that's hard for Americans to do because of our history. But the right to do something does not equal the demand to do something or the wisdom to necessarily do it. We might have to, like you said, be humble, surrender our rights, because it's better for someone in the community. What would you give up for a member of your family?
Yeah.
Well, we're called brothers and sisters. That's not just a convenient thing to introduce the preacher at a lectureship. It's real. It means something. We are brothers and we are sisters, and that might entail giving up, surrendering those rights, or surrendering our time or our financial means or something like that to help one another.
Yeah. Well, the second bell has rung on our class. We've gone a little long. Let's just wrap it up with just a quick thought. What's one takeaway that we have for these 3 words and the fellowship? I want to bring up an idea. I was actually racking my brain, like where did I heard of this? Jeremy, I think this actually came from your dad's newsletter. Anyway, There's
you want
a
to drop
story
the
that's been-
website in? You want to drop the website
Oh, well, yeah,
in?
we'll put that in the comments.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
So he was relaying a story about a very famous preacher who decided one week that he wanted to do a sermon that did not have any practical application. It was going to be completely theology driven, and we're going to push this forward. And he, at the end of the sermon, he felt kind of bad that no one's going to get anything out of this. It's not going to be able to transform anyone's lives. But then someone came up to him, maybe it was that week or several weeks later, and said it was that sermon and the idea that no matter what else happens, these things are true, that there's something that we as Christians can be united on, and that's the strength that gets me through troublesome times. And as I'm thinking of our COVID-19, and I'm thinking of the 2,000 years of division in the church, I think that when we think about fellowship, when we think about truly being united, we have to think about those deep core issues that we've talked about tonight that will always bring us back to Jesus. So that's my concluding thought. Jeremy, what do you got? And we'll wrap.
Right along those lines, those core things that bring us back to Jesus. I've used the analogy before. The closer we get to God, the closer we get to one another. You imagine it, and I tried to turn the slide into something I could use on here, and I couldn't. But if you imagine it as a triangle, okay, and God's at the top, as two people move closer to God, they're going to move closer to one another. Mm-hmm. As we mature, as we learn humility, as we follow the apostles' teachings, as we grow in fellowship with one another, we're going to grow closer. And that's the core, is to come back to this idea and the foundation, like we've said for 2 weeks now, that brings it all together. God has made this Jesus both Lord and Christ. The closer we get to Christ, the more in fellowship we're going to be with one another.
Well said. Good place to end. That's it for week 3 of our class looking at Acts 2 and what it means to be the church. Join us next week. We'll cover more than 3 words, but not too many more.
Not too many.
So we'll see you next week. Bye.